11:47 hours. On the wet deck of a homemade low-profile craft, one of the cartel operators made a reckless move. He raised an RPG-7 toward an approaching helicopter and pulled the trigger. That single decision started a countdown. In exactly 4 minutes and 30 seconds, everything around him would change. But the story began half an hour earlier, high above the ocean at 30,000 feet, where a P-8A Poseidon was not searching beneath the waves. Today, its focus was the surface. Its AN/APS-154 radar was sweeping the water with such precision that it could pick out a tiny life raft in terrible weather. Then the screens lit up. A small contact was moving at 45 knots, too fast for a fishing boat, too bold for a normal civilian vessel, and too suspicious to ignore. The target was an LPV, a low-profile vessel, a semi-submersible craft designed to ride barely 18 inches above the waterline. It was built for one purpose: to disappear. But to the operators inside the Poseidon, the LPV's attempt to hide was not impressive. It was like trying to avoid a security camera by covering your face with one hand. Instead of making you invisible, it only makes you stand out. That tiny radar return triggered a chain of events the crew below could not possibly understand. The trap was already forming. The RPG launch became more than a reckless act. It became a signal, carried across 150 nautical miles of ocean to the one place the crew on the water could not see: the Combat Information Center of the USS Bainbridge. The destroyer was operating under MCON, a condition of near-total electronic silence. To anyone scanning the area, it was almost not there. Not just a ship, but a digital shadow quietly processing the P-8's targeting data in microseconds. And now it had released its hunters. The response did not come in the form of another ship. It came as a 23,000-pound MH-60S Nighthawk, flying so low that its rotor wash kicked spray off the ocean surface. Inside, strapped to the deck, a special operations team ran their final checks. The harsh vibration of the airframe was familiar. Nobody needed a speech. They understood the mission. They were not being sent in for a routine stop. They were being sent to remove a serious threat. Below them was a custom-built LPV, a remarkable piece of cartel engineering, throwing a 50-foot wall of spray behind it. 4 300-horsepower outboard engines roared at full power, driving a fiberglass battering ram across the waves. But the moment that RPG-7 was aimed at a U.S. Navy asset, the situation changed completely. This was no longer a simple interception. It was a hunt, and the hunters were closing in. The Nighthawk dropped lower. The pilot pushed the helicopter down toward the waves until the radar altimeter began warning him: 30 feet. That was all the space between the aircraft and the ocean. This was not just aggressive flying. It was physics turned into a tactic. By staying that low, the helicopter hid beneath the radar horizon, using the curvature of the Earth as a shield. It is the same reason you cannot see a ship 50 miles away from the beach. The planet itself gets in the way. The Nighthawk had placed a literal wall of ocean between itself and the target. One small mistake, one moment of lost focus, and a multi-million-dollar aircraft would hit the water at speed. The pressure on the pilot was enormous, but it was a calculated risk and only the first layer of a much larger deception. At the same time, the pilot switched the aircraft into total electronic silence. Weather radar went dark. The IFF transponder shut down. The radio moved to a receive-only encrypted channel. The helicopter did not simply become quiet. On the electromagnetic spectrum, it vanished. For the crew on the LPV, it was like trying to listen in the middle of a rock concert while someone suddenly turned off every sense you were relying on. They knew something was out there. They knew they were being tracked, but the signals they depended on had gone empty. They were now blind, confused, and alone. The real attack, however, was not coming from the helicopter. It was coming from 150 miles away. Inside the USS Bainbridge's Combat Information Center, the electronic warfare officer activated the trap. This was not basic jamming. Jamming is loud. It is the electronic version of shouting over someone so they cannot hear. This was far more refined. This was spoofing. The ship's AN/SLQ-32 system became a digital mirror. It captured the incoming radar pulse from the LPV, copied it, adjusted it, and sent it back with perfectly timed delays. The result was chaos. On the LPV's cheap radar screen, one helicopter became 3, then 4. Perfect false copies appeared from different directions. This was less like a traditional military move and more like a cyber attack against human decision-making. The Navy was not trying to break their equipment. It was overloading their minds. The men on that vessel were already tense. Now their instruments were feeding them a completely false version of reality. Their command system was simple: one person yelling to another over the noise of engines and panic. And in that moment, it became useless. Confusion spread across the LPV. Their entire tactical picture was a lie, built by a system far beyond the horizon. The human brain is not designed to process that kind of conflict. You hear one helicopter, but your screen shows four. Your instincts are screaming one thing, while your instruments are showing another. Their response was basic and desperate. A heavy-mounted gun sent tracers into the empty sky, stitching bright lines through the air at targets that were not really there. They were not fighting the Nighthawk, they were fighting ghosts. Then came the final reckless move. One of the operators lifted the RPG again and swung it toward the Nighthawk's true direction, making one last attempt to threaten the invisible hunter. The team inside the helicopter did not react with panic. The pilot did not answer immediately. He did something smarter. He banked hard, pulling the helicopter away in a maneuver that looked exactly like a retreat. It was a classic feint, a tactic older than modern warfare itself. Show weakness. Invite confidence. Let the opponent believe their pressure is working. It is the psychological version of a boxer dropping his guard on purpose, inviting a punch he already knows how to counter. On the deck of the LPV, they likely thought they had won. They believed they had pushed back the U.S. Navy. And in that brief moment of false victory, the helmsman made the mistake that ended the chase. He turned the boat to run. By doing that, he exposed the one thing he should have protected at all costs: the four screaming outboard engines. The bait had been taken. The trap was closed. The false retreat was over. The hunt began. The Nighthawk did not simply turn around. It pivoted in the air like a predator changing direction with mechanical precision. The aircraft dropped back into position, close to the surface, moving with a purpose that was almost unnatural. The time for deception was finished. Now came the moment of undeniable reality. From the LPV's point of view, the Phantom had become real. One moment, there was nothing. The next, the helicopter was there, emerging from nowhere like something rising out of the sea. Inside the aircraft, the crew was not aiming by instinct alone. The system was aiming with them. The target had already been marked, not by the helicopter itself, but through the larger network connected to the USS Bainbridge. That data moved through satellites and sensors in milliseconds, feeding the Nighthawk the information it needed. The crew were not just flying a helicopter, they were operating the final piece of a much larger machine. The eye was in the sky. The brain was on the destroyer. The fist was on the helicopter. Together they moved as one organism. Then came the sound. The GAU-17 minigun began to spin up. It is not the sound of a single shot. It is a mechanical warning, a rising buzz that signals overwhelming precision and scale. For 1.5 seconds, the air was filled with a storm of controlled force. A stream of 7.62mm rounds poured from the side of the helicopter at roughly 50 rounds per second. But this was not random spraying. It was a surgical strike at 120 knots. The goal was not to sink the vessel. The goal was to stop it. The rounds tore through the four outboard engines. Covers, propellers, and engine blocks broke apart in a cloud of metal fragments. The LPV's 45-knot charge ended instantly. In the space of a heartbeat, the craft went from a charging animal to a dead weight in the water, its momentum fading into the waves. The contrast was almost unreal. One moment, it was roaring across the ocean. The next, it was silent and helpless. Then came the quiet. The high-pitched sound of the minigun stopped, replaced by the steady thump of the Nighthawk's rotors as the helicopter held a perfect hover above the water. But the mission was not finished. The minigun spoke again. A second precise burst struck the forward cargo section. This was not random. The fire control system, still supported by the larger network, calculated the impact point with exact purpose, and that purpose revealed a deeper doctrine. The Navy was not trying to create a massive blast. That would destroy the vessel, create unnecessary environmental risk, and erase valuable evidence. Instead, this was economic neutralization. The rounds were intended to pierce the sealed containers inside, allowing seawater to contaminate the high-value illegal cargo. Once that happened, the shipment was no longer usable, no longer recoverable, and no longer profitable. The message was simple and cold. We do not just stop the boat, we break the business model behind it. With the threat neutralized, the final phase began. From the side of the Nighthawk, a 35-foot rigid-hull inflatable boat hit the water with a heavy splash, its engine already alive. This was not just a small boat, it was a purpose-built maritime interception platform designed for speed, stability, and close-quarters control. The Special Operations team moved with practiced precision, descending into the boat in one smooth sequence. In the time it takes most people to find their keys, the team was already on the water and moving toward the disabled LPV. That speed mattered. Every second the helicopter stayed in a hover made it more exposed. The faster the team got onto the water, the safer the entire operation became. Their approach was not chaotic. It was controlled, calm, and professional. The crew on the LPV had been stunned, disoriented by the minigun, stripped of their speed, and mentally defeated by a battle they never fully understood. They were secured without further resistance. But the mission was not only about taking people into custody. Those men were not just suspects. They were intelligence sources. Their capture could reveal routes, methods, leadership connections, and operational patterns. That information would go back into the system, making the network sharper for the next interception. The engines were gone. The $60 million payload was now ruined by seawater, and a valuable stream of human intelligence was in U.S. custody. It was a complete result. Mission accomplished. To anyone watching, the roar of the minigun may have felt like the climax. It was not. It was simply the final line of code in a program that had been running for 30 minutes. The physical takedown was only the visible end. The real battle had already been won in the digital space. The entire engagement can be understood like a brutal business school case study in asymmetric competition. The cartel crew made a classic amateur mistake. They invested almost everything into hardware. Bigger engines, a stealthy hull, and a powerful but primitive launcher. Their entire plan depended on one fragile asset reaching its destination. For them, return on investment was tied to a single boat surviving a single trip. That is a 20th century mindset. The U.S. Navy's real investment was not simply the helicopter or the destroyer. Those were delivery platforms. The true advantage was the invisible architecture connecting everything together. Link 16 data networks created a shared awareness between platforms. Satellite relays made distance almost irrelevant. The Aegis combat system turned raw information from multiple sensors into a unified picture, constantly updating the battlefield in real time. That network is a living ecosystem. Its value is not measured by one mission. It is measured by how completely it dominates the space around it. The Navy was not only fighting a boat, it was fighting the minds of the people on the boat. Military strategists call this getting inside the opponent's OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, and act. By hiding the real threat and feeding the LPV a stream of false targets, the Navy did not just move faster. It shattered the crew's ability to understand what was happening. Before the crew could process one event, the Navy had already acted on a decision made several steps earlier. Every choice the crew made, launching the RPG, turning to escape, shifting course in panic, came from a false reality carefully shaped for them by a system operating far beyond the horizon. They were not responding to what was actually happening. They were responding to what the network allowed them to see. Their world had been reduced to a controlled illusion, a tightly engineered bubble where every decision they believed was instinctive or tactical had already been predicted and guided. They thought they were fighting a helicopter. In reality, they were interacting with a supercomputer-backed network capable of anticipating their behavior and shaping their options. Their resistance was not independent action. It was a series of forced moves, each one falling neatly into a model that had already accounted for them. They were not truly making choices. They were performing in a script written moments before they acted. And in any script written by a system that sees faster, thinks faster, and adapts instantly, there is only one possible ending. It was the tactical equivalent of being trapped inside the Matrix, except the code was not just defining the world around them. It was rewriting itself in real time to guarantee their failure. Every sensor feed, every false signal, every perceived threat was part of a dynamic story controlled by an intelligence that never lost the plot. The crew believed they were improvising under pressure, but they were only playing their assigned roles in a story that had already reached its conclusion. And that is the real lesson of this engagement. It is one of the central truths of modern warfare. The cartel crew brought a muscle car to a fight against an AI-powered hedge fund. One side relied on horsepower, aggression, and the illusion of control. The other relied on data, prediction, coordination, and the ability to shape the entire environment until the outcome was not just likely, but inevitable. In this era, victory does not go to the loudest machine or the boldest move. It goes to the smartest network.